It was an inferno so fierce that its glow could be seen from 50 miles away. In the heart of London, the Crystal Palace, once the epitome of Victorian engineering, an innovation that dazzled the world, was consumed by flames on the night of November 30th, 1936. For 4 hours, 438 firefighters watched helplessly as the building melted before their eyes. This was no ordinary fire. It was the death of a dream, of a world-changing achievement. But as the palace crumbled to ash, something far darker emerged from the wreckage. Hidden in its abandoned corridors were the bodies of forgotten souls, lost to time, tragedy, and the secrets of the palace itself. How could such a marvel, the pride of an era, have turned to dust so quickly? The answers are buried beneath the ruins, and they will change everything we thought we knew about this architectural wonder. The dream that defied limits. The year was 1849, and an audacious dream was born. An iron and glass palace that would change the world. Joseph Paxton stood in the gardens of Chatsworth House, staring at a lily pad. Not just any lily pad. This was Victoria amazonica, a massive aquatic plant with leaves that could support the weight of a child. The lily structure fascinated him, radiating ribs, cross supports underneath. Nature had solved the problem of supporting enormous weight with minimal material. Paxton was not an architect. He was a gardener. The son of a farmer, he had worked his way up from nothing to become head gardener for the Duke of Devonshire. He built greenhouses, massive ones, structures of iron and glass that captured sunlight and created tropical paradises in the English countryside. But now Britain needed something unprecedented. Prince Albert had proposed an exhibition, a great exhibition, a showcase of industrial achievement that would prove British supremacy to the world. They needed a building larger than anything ever constructed, building that could be erected in less than a year. 245 designs had been submitted. All of them were rejected. The Royal Commission was in crisis. Time was running out. Then Paxton sketched his vision on a piece of blotting paper during a railway board meeting. 9 days later, he presented his design to the commission. It was revolutionary. It was impossible. It was exactly what they needed. The design borrowed everything from his greenhouses: prefabricated iron columns, standardized glass panes, a modular system that could be mass-produced and assembled on site like a giant toy. The building would be nearly 2,000 feet long, over 400 feet wide, tall enough to enclose mature elm trees that already grew on the site in Hyde Park. The calculations were staggering. 300,000 panes of glass, 3,300 iron columns, 2,300 girders, over 700,000 square feet of floor space. Enough iron to build 3 Eiffel Towers. Enough glass to cover 17 football fields. Critics called it insane. They said the glass would shatter in a storm. The iron would buckle under its own weight. Birds would crash into the transparent walls and die by the thousands. The building would collapse during the opening ceremony, crushing Queen Victoria and the assembled dignitaries beneath tons of twisted metal and broken glass. Paxton didn't flinch. He knew his design would work. The lily pad had taught him the secret: distribute the load, use the minimum material for maximum strength, let the structure be light, flexible, responsive. Construction began in September of 1850. The site in Hyde Park transformed into an industrial ballet. 2,000 workers swarmed the grounds. They erected iron columns at a rate of 60 per day. Glaziers installed 18,000 panes of glass every week. The modular design meant that each piece fit perfectly with every other piece. No stone was cut. No bricks were laid. The entire structure was bolted together. The speed was unprecedented. Within 4 months, the skeleton stood complete. Within 6 months, the glass skin was in place. The building rose from nothing like a dream made solid. But speed came with compromise. The glass panes were held in place with putty. Wooden sash bars separated each section. The iron frame conducted heat with terrifying efficiency. These were not flaws anyone noticed. Not then. The building was too magnificent, too impossible. Paxton's workers painted the iron framework in primary colors: red, yellow, blue. The effect was magical. Light poured through the glass roof and scattered into rainbow patterns across the floor. The interior felt like standing inside a cloud. The elm trees rose through the ceiling on the southern end, their branches spreading beneath the arched transept. Nature and industry merged into one transcendent space. The final cost was £79,800. A fortune, but cheap beyond measure for what had been achieved. Private investors funded the construction. This was not a government project. This was enterprise, ambition. The raw force of Victorian capitalism turned into architecture. When the building was finished, even the critics fell silent. Nothing like it had ever existed. The Crystal Palace, a name given by the satirical magazine Punch, meant as mockery but embraced as poetry, stood as proof that humanity had entered a new age. An age of glass and light. An age where anything was possible. But was this building ever meant to last? Or was it always a temporary marvel, a butterfly that would shine brilliantly and then disappear? The Great Exhibition of 1851. In the summer of 1851, the Crystal Palace opened its doors to the world, and it was more magnificent than anyone could have imagined. Queen Victoria herself inaugurated the exhibition on May 1st. She arrived in a procession of 9 carriages. The royal family walked through the central nave while cannons fired salutes and choirs sang. 25,000 invited guests filled the interior. The Queen wrote in her diary that the sight was the greatest day of her life. She called it a triumph unlike any other. The numbers told the story of excess and ambition. Over 100,000 exhibits filled the palace. Manufacturers from around the globe displayed their finest achievements: steam engines, hydraulic presses, agricultural machinery, textiles, ceramics, sculptures, musical instruments. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, the largest in the world, sat on display in a gilded cage. 6 million people visited during the exhibition's 5-month run. 6 million, in a nation of 27 million. Working-class families saved for months to afford the train fare to London and the 1 shilling entrance fee. They walked through the palace in wonder, gaping at machines that could perform the work of 100 men. They saw locomotives that could travel at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. They watched industrial looms weaving complex patterns without human hands guiding the thread. This was more than an exhibition. This was propaganda, a statement. Britain wanted the world to see its power, its dominance, its technological superiority. The empire stretched across the globe, and the Crystal Palace became the physical manifestation of imperial might. But beneath the spectacle, contradictions festered. The working class who built the machines on display earned wages that barely sustained life. Children labored in factories. Coal miners died by the hundreds in collapsed shafts. The wealth that funded the exhibition came from exploitation at home and abroad. India, Africa, the Caribbean. Resources flowed into Britain and manufactured goods flowed out, making fortunes for industrialists while indigenous economies collapsed. Inside the palace, these realities were invisible. The building transformed everything into beauty. Light, filtered through glass, turned the harsh steel of machinery into something almost sacred. The exhibits were arranged with theatrical precision. Each section told a story of progress, of advancement, of civilization marching forward into an enlightened future. The refreshment courts served thousands of meals daily. Schweppes provided carbonated drinks from glass fountains. The facilities became famous for something else too: public flush toilets. Over 800,000 people paid 1 penny to use them during the exhibition. This innovation alone generated significant revenue and introduced modern sanitation to the masses. Foreign visitors arrived from every continent. They marveled at British engineering. They admired the organization, the cleanliness, the efficiency. The exhibition generated enormous soft power. Britain wasn't just a military force. It was a cultural and technological beacon, a nation that could conceive and execute something as grand as the Crystal Palace must be respected, must be emulated. Prince Albert had achieved his goal. The exhibition turned a profit of £186,000. That money would fund the construction of museums in South Kensington, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum. These institutions still stand today, permanent legacies of a temporary building. But the Crystal Palace itself? That was another question. The original plan always called for its demolition after the exhibition closed. Hyde Park would be returned to green space. The iron and glass would be sold for scrap. The dream would end. The public revolted. Petitions circulated. Newspapers editorialized. Thousands of Londoners demanded the palace be preserved. It was too important, too beautiful, too symbolic of what Britain had become. A private consortium purchased the building. They would dismantle it carefully, move it, rebuild it in a new location. The Crystal Palace would live on. It would become a permanent fixture in the London landscape, a monument to progress that would endure for generations, or so they believed. What they didn't understand was that some dreams are not meant to be permanent. Some structures exist only for their moment, and forcing them to persist beyond their intended lifespan carries consequences no one could predict. A monument to progress. As decades passed, the Crystal Palace became more than just a building. It became a symbol, standing tall over London's skyline, representing the peak of Victorian ambition. The palace found its new home in Sydenham Hill, southeast of London. The site offered 200 acres of landscaped grounds. The reconstruction began in 1852 and took 2 years to complete. But this was not a simple reassembly. The building grew. The designers added extra wings, increased the height, extended the length to over 1,600 feet. The new Crystal Palace was larger than its Hyde Park predecessor, more elaborate, more ambitious. The cost ballooned to £1.3 million. 1,300 workers labored to erect the structure. The grounds were transformed into a Victorian fantasyland. Artificial lakes, cascading fountains, life-sized sculptures of dinosaurs emerging from the water, botanical gardens, Egyptian courts, Greek courts, Roman courts, medieval courts. Each section recreated historical civilizations with obsessive detail. The palace reopened in June of 1854. Queen Victoria attended once again. The spectacle was even grander than before. A 12,000-pipe organ filled the interior with sound. Orchestras performed for audiences of thousands. The building became London's premier entertainment destination. Over the next 8 decades, the Crystal Palace hosted an astonishing variety of events: international exhibitions, horticultural shows, cat shows, dog shows, poultry shows, athletic competitions. The first FA Cup finals were played on the palace grounds between 1895 and 1914. Aeronautical exhibitions featured early aircraft suspended from the ceiling, circus performances, opera, ballet. Thomas Edison visited to demonstrate his phonograph. The building became a cultural omnibus, containing every form of Victorian and Edwardian entertainment. But maintaining such a structure demanded constant resources. The glass required endless cleaning. The iron framework needed regular painting to prevent rust. The putty sealing the glass panes deteriorated and had to be replaced. Staff costs mounted. Heating the vast interior during winter consumed enormous quantities of coal. The annual operating budget exceeded £100,000. Revenue could not keep pace. The palace company lurched from one financial crisis to another. They tried everything: fireworks displays, grand galas, reduced admission prices. Nothing stabilized the economics. The building was simply too large, too expensive, too complicated to maintain profitably. By the early 20th century, sections of the palace stood empty. The company rented portions to private businesses, studios, storage facilities, anything to generate income. During World War I, the military commandeered the building. It became a naval training depot. 12,000 sailors lived inside the glass walls. The Navy renamed it HMS Victory 6. The irony was lost on no one. A palace dedicated to peace and progress transformed into a military installation. After the war, the palace reopened to the public, but it never recovered its former glory. The 1920s brought brief revival. Radio broadcasting began from the South Tower. The BBC transmitted programs across London. But by the 1930s, the building had become an anachronism, a relic of a vanished age. Attendance dwindled. Maintenance was deferred. The once gleaming glass grew dirty. Paint peeled from the iron framework. Hidden from public view, other things were happening. Sections that should have been demolished were simply closed off. Corridors led nowhere. Vast storage rooms filled with forgotten exhibition materials, surplus furniture, moth-eaten tapestries, crumbling plaster casts. The building became a mausoleum of its own past, and in those forgotten spaces, people found shelter. Homeless men and women discovered entrances that were no longer guarded. They slipped inside after dark, made camps in the abandoned wings. The palace that once symbolized Britain's might now concealed the destitute victims of economic collapse. The Great Depression had hit Britain hard. Unemployment soared, poverty spread, and some of those who had nowhere else to go found refuge inside the Crystal Palace. The building's managers knew, everyone knew, but acknowledging the situation would force them to confront uncomfortable truths. Easier to look away, to pretend the problem didn't exist, to focus on maintaining the public areas while the hidden sections decayed. By November of 1936, the Crystal Palace had become a fragile shell. The glass was brittle, the wood was dry, the iron framework had corroded in places. The putty sealing the panes had hardened and cracked. The building was not just old, it was vulnerable, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And on the night of November 30th, that spark arrived. The invisible cost of innovation. What no one knew about the Crystal Palace was that it was held together by a hidden danger, a dangerously flammable substance that would one day betray it. The genius of Paxton's design was also its fatal flaw. Everything that made the Crystal Palace possible, the prefabrication, the modular assembly, the unprecedented speed of construction, relied on materials that seemed permanent but were fundamentally fragile. Consider the putty, linseed oil putty, the substance that sealed every glass pane. 300,000 panes, each one bordered by putty. The putty had to be flexible when applied, moldable, capable of filling gaps. But over time, linseed oil oxidizes, the putty hardens, becomes brittle, and most critically, it becomes flammable. By 1936, the putty in the Crystal Palace was 85 years old. The original Hyde Park installation, then disassembly, then reassembly in Sydenham. Every stress, every temperature fluctuation, every season of expansion and contraction had degraded the material. The putty had transformed from a sealant into kindling. The wooden sash bars were no better. These thin strips of timber separated each glass section. They provided the framework for the glazing. Paxton chose wood because it was lighter than iron, easier to work with, and cheaper. But wood exposed to decades of temperature extremes dries out completely. The moisture content drops to nearly zero. The cells become hollow. The material turns into fuel. Tests conducted years later on similar structures revealed the danger. Dried linseed putty burns at temperatures as low as 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Seasoned wood ignites at roughly the same temperature. Once burning, both materials generate intense heat, the kind of heat that can spread fire with terrifying speed. Then there was the iron framework. Iron doesn't burn, but it does something almost worse. It conducts heat. A single iron column, heated at one end, will transfer that thermal energy throughout its entire length within minutes. The Crystal Palace contained over 3,000 iron columns. They formed a network, a heat distribution system that would turn a localized fire into a building-wide catastrophe. The ventilation system compounded the problem. The palace was designed for airflow. Hot air rose through vents in the arched roof. Cool air entered through openable panels at ground level. This created natural circulation, perfect for regulating temperature during exhibitions, perfect for feeding oxygen to flames during a fire. No sprinkler system existed. Fire suppression. Technology in the 1840s was primitive. The assumption was that the building's openness would prevent fire from spreading. Glass doesn't burn. Iron doesn't burn. Any small fire could be easily controlled. But this logic ignored the supporting materials. The putty, the wood, the furniture inside, the curtains, the decorations, all of it fuel. The palace company employed a night watchman, one man. His job was to walk through the building after closing, checking for problems, an impossible task. The structure covered over 700,000 square feet. It would take hours to thoroughly inspect even a fraction of the space. And many areas were sealed off, locked, forgotten. Records from the early 1930s show repeated maintenance failures. Roof leaks went unrepaired. Broken glass panes were left shattered. Sections of the building were condemned as unsafe but not demolished. The company lacked funds for proper upkeep. They operated on borrowed money and deferred dreams. Insurance underwriters had grown nervous. They reduced coverage, increased premiums. They recognized what the building's management refused to acknowledge. The Crystal Palace was a disaster waiting to happen, a structure held together by obsolete materials and wishful thinking. In 1934, a small fire broke out in one of the storage rooms. It was contained quickly. Minimal damage. But the incident should have served as warning, should have prompted a comprehensive safety review. Instead, it was written off as an anomaly. Nothing changed. The people sleeping in the abandoned wings knew the danger better than anyone. They saw the decay up close, the rotting wood, the crumbling putty, the rust eating through iron joints. They whispered about it among themselves, joked darkly that the whole place would go up like matchsticks if anyone was foolish enough to light a cigarette in the wrong spot. They had no idea how right they were. By the autumn of 1936, the Crystal Palace was not a monument, it was a bomb. Every component of its construction had been transformed by time into an accelerant. The building existed in a state of chemical readiness. All it needed was ignition. And on November 30th, in a small room in the southern transept, something sparked. An electrical fault, most likely. A frayed wire. A short circuit. The kind of minor malfunction that happens in old buildings every day without consequence. But inside the Crystal Palace, there would be consequences. Terrible ones. The building's hidden flaws would not remain hidden much longer. The invisible cost of innovation was about to become devastatingly visible, and the world would watch as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements consumed itself in flame. The forgotten people within the walls. Amid the grand exhibitions and crowds, the Crystal Palace hid another secret, an underclass of people who lived in its shadows, unseen and forgotten. They came in, through the service entrances, the basement doors, the broken windows in the north wing. They arrived after dark when the staff had gone home and the building stood empty. They carried blankets, sometimes a bit of food. They knew which sections were safe, which rooms were warm, which corners would shield them from winter wind. Thomas Aitken was one of them, a former factory worker from Bermondsey. He lost his job in 1931 when the textile mill closed, lost his flat 6 months later when the savings ran out. He tried the workhouses, stayed in shelters, slept on the street. But the Crystal Palace offered something those places did not: dignity, space. The illusion of shelter that didn't feel like charity or punishment. Thomas found a room in the Eastern Gallery. It had been a storage space for exhibition equipment. Wooden crates lined the walls. He cleared a corner, made a bed from old curtains. The glass roof above let in moonlight. On clear nights, he could see stars through the dirty panes. It almost felt like freedom. Mary Wickham lived 3 corridors away, a widow. Her husband died in the war. Her children had scattered to find work in other cities. She wrote them letters but never heard back. The pension barely covered food. Rent was impossible. She found the palace in the winter of 1935, a women's room with a working fireplace. She couldn't light fires, of course. Too much risk of being discovered, but the room trapped residual heat from the floors below. It was warmer than the street. There were others, perhaps a dozen, perhaps more. They avoided each other mostly, an unspoken agreement. Don't acknowledge what we're doing here. Don't draw attention. Don't give anyone a reason to throw us out. They learned the patterns. The night watchman made his rounds at 9, 11, and 3. As long as you stayed quiet during those times, he never ventured into the closed sections. The day staff arrived at 8 in the morning. You had to be gone by then, out through the same passages you entered. Invisible again. The irony was profound. This building, constructed to showcase British industrial triumph, now sheltered the victims of that same industrial system. These were not lazy people, not criminals. They were workers who had been discarded when they were no longer profitable. The economy had no use for them. Society had no place for them. So, they made a place inside the hollow shell of Victorian ambition. On cold nights, Mary would walk through the empty galleries. She remembered visiting as a child. Her father brought her in 1897 for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebration. The palace had been magnificent then. Music, lights, thousands of people in their finest clothes. She had eaten ices and watched fireworks explode over the South Tower. Now the galleries stood dark and silent. Exhibition cases sat empty. Dust covered everything. The building felt like a tomb, a monument to a world that had died. Walking through it at night, Mary sometimes felt like a ghost haunting the corpse of British glory. Thomas tried to maintain routines. He woke early, washed his face with water from a bathroom sink that still worked. He kept his corner clean, folded his blankets each morning, arranged his few possessions with care. If he was going to be homeless, he would not be disordered. He would not surrender his humanity to circumstances. But the building was decaying around them. Everyone could feel it. The smell of rot. The sound of wood creaking in ways that suggested structural instability. Sections of the glass roof had cracked. Rain came through in places. Pools of water collected on the floors. In winter, they froze. The other residents whispered warnings to each other. The southeast corner was unsafe. The floor there had weakened. Someone had fallen through once into the basement level. Broken his leg. He disappeared after that. No one knew if he sought help or simply moved somewhere else. By the autumn of 1936, Thomas had noticed something else. More broken glass, more exposed wood. The building felt different, more dangerous. He considered leaving, finding somewhere else. But where? Winter was coming. The palace was shelter, imperfect, decaying shelter, but shelter nonetheless. On the evening of November 30th, Thomas returned to his corner around 7, earlier than usual. He'd spent the day walking through South London looking for work. Nothing. No one was hiring. He was tired, cold, hungry. He lay down on his makeshift bed and closed his eyes. Mary arrived around 8. She had spent the afternoon at a soup kitchen in Deptford. The volunteers had given her bread and tea, acts of kindness that made her want to weep. She settled into her room, arranged her blankets, said a quiet prayer, the same prayer she'd said every night since her husband died. Please let tomorrow be better. Please let there be hope. Neither of them knew what was happening in the southern transept. Neither could smell the smoke yet. The fire was still small, contained in a single room, growing steadily but not yet visible, not yet dangerous enough to trigger alarm. Within hours, everything would change. The building that had sheltered them would become a trap. The walls that had protected them would become a furnace. And the world outside, which had ignored their existence for so long, would be forced to confront the brutal truth. The Crystal Palace had not just hidden architectural flaws, it had hidden human suffering. And when the fire came, that suffering would be revealed in the most terrible way imaginable. The fire that no one saw. Coming November 30th, 1936, the fire that would destroy the Crystal Palace began in the dead of night, an unstoppable force that no one could contain. The exact cause remains uncertain. The official inquiry suggested an electrical fault, in a small office in the southern transept. AUET, spark from frayed wiring. Insulation that had degraded over decades. A short circuit that generated heat. That heat ignited papers on a desk. The papers ignited the wooden desk itself. The desk ignited the floor. This happened sometime around 7:30 in the evening. The night watchman, Samuel Green, was making his first round. He walked through the main galleries, checked the doors, tested the locks. Everything seemed normal. He did not enter the closed southern section. He had no reason to. That area had been sealed for months. By 8 o'clock, the fire had spread to the walls. The wooden paneling caught. The flames climbed toward the ceiling. Heat radiated outward. The temperature in the room climbed past 500 degrees. The old putty sealing the glass panels began to soften, to bubble, to ignite. Smoke filtered through gaps in the walls. It rose through ventilation shafts. The palace's natural airflow system, designed to circulate fresh air, now pulled smoke and heat throughout the building. The fire was breathing, growing stronger with every passing minute. At 8:25, a secretary named Margaret Donnelly was locking up her office in the northern wing. She smelled something burning, not immediately alarming. Old buildings always had strange smells. But this was different, acrid, chemical. She walked toward the source. The smoke was coming from the direction of the southern transept. Margaret ran back to her office, telephoned the fire brigade. Her voice was steady. She reported smoke, possible fire, the Crystal Palace, Sydenham Hill. The operator assured her help was coming. By 8:30, the fire had breached the office. It spilled into the corridor. The corridor had wooden floors, wooden wall panels, fabric decorations. The flames consumed everything. The iron columns began conducting heat. The temperature differential created pressure. Glass panes started shattering. Each breaking pane released more oxygen into the fire. Each breaking pane created openings that allowed the flames to spread. Samuel Green heard the glass breaking. He ran toward the sound. When he reached the southern transept, he saw orange light flickering behind the doors. He tried to open them. The metal handles were too hot to touch. He could hear the roar inside, a sound like wind, like breath. The building was inhaling fire. He ran for the exit, found a telephone, called the fire brigade again. This was not smoke. This was catastrophe. They needed every engine available. The first fire crews arrived at 8:45. 6 engines, 40 firefighters. They unrolled hoses, connected to hydrants, aimed water at the southern transept. The streams hit the glass walls and evaporated into steam. The heat was too intense. The water couldn't penetrate deep enough to reach the source. The fire brigade commander, Bertram Pollock, assessed the situation immediately. This was already beyond control. The building was too large, the fire too hot, too widespread. He called for reinforcements, every available engine in South London. By 9 o'clock, the entire southern transept was engulfed. Flames shot 200 feet into the night sky. The glow was visible from central London, 10 miles away. People stopped on the streets, stared at the horizon. The light was so bright it looked like sunrise in the wrong direction. Inside the palace, Thomas Aitken woke to smoke. His corner was in the eastern gallery, far from the fire's origin. But smoke travels faster than flames. It was filling the corridors. The air tasted like burning oil, like chemicals. He grabbed his blanket, ran toward the nearest exit. The corridors were dark. The smoke obscured everything. Thomas knew the route. He'd walked it hundreds of times. But panic distorts familiarity. He turned left instead of right, found himself in a dead end, a storage room he'd never seen before. He retraced his steps. The smoke was thicker now. He dropped to his knees. Air was clearer. Near the floor, he crawled. Mary Wickham heard the glass shattering. The sound echoed through the building like artillery. She opened her door, saw orange light dancing on the corridor walls. Heat rolled toward her in waves. She knew she had to leave. She grabbed nothing, just ran. She found a staircase, descended toward the ground level. The smoke was everywhere. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe properly. She held her sleeve over her mouth, kept moving. Her lungs burned. Her eyes streamed tears. The heat was unbearable. She burst through a service door into the winter night. Cold air hit her face. She collapsed onto the grass, coughed until she vomited, looked back at the building. The Crystal Palace was being devoured. The southern transept had become a pillar of flame. The fire was spreading north. The iron framework glowed red. Glass panels exploded in cascading waves. Each explosion sent shards raining down onto the lawns. The sound was constant, breaking, cracking, the roar of combustion. More fire engines arrived, 20, 30, 40, 88 engines by 10 o'clock. 438 firefighters surrounded the building. They aimed their hoses at the flames. The water pressure was insufficient. The hydrants couldn't supply enough flow. Some crews drew water from the ornamental lakes. It made no difference. The fire was consuming everything faster than they could respond. Commander Pollock made the decision at 9:30. They couldn't save the building. The goal now was containment. Prevent the fire from spreading to nearby homes. Protect the surrounding neighborhoods. Let the palace burn. Thomas found an exit in the north wing. He stumbled outside around 9:45. His lungs were seared, his clothes were singed, but he was alive. He stood on the lawn and watched the only home he'd had for 2 years being destroyed. Other residents emerged. 3, 5, 7. They gathered in small clusters, said nothing. There was nothing to say. The building had sheltered them. Now it was killing itself. But not everyone made it out. Some were too deep inside. Some were asleep when the smoke reached them. Some got lost in the labyrinth of corridors and never found the exits. Their fates would not be known for days. Not until investigators could enter the ruins. Not until they found the bodies in the ash. By 10 o'clock, the fire had consumed half the palace. The central transept collapsed. The iron framework twisted and fell. The sound was apocalyptic, metal screaming as it warped in the heat. 200 feet of arched roof fell in on itself. Millions of pounds of glass and iron crashing down. The fire continued through the night. It would burn for 4 hours. It would destroy everything. Every exhibition hall, every gallery, every corridor. 8 decades of history reduced to slag and ash. The dream that Joseph Paxton had sketched on blotting paper. The palace that had housed the great exhibition. The symbol of Victorian triumph, all of it gone. And standing on the lawns, watching the destruction, were the forgotten people, the homeless residents, the ones who had lived inside the palace's secret spaces. They bore witness to the end. They alone understood what was truly being lost. Not just a building, but shelter, refuge. The last place in London that had room for people society had discarded. The fire would burn until after midnight, but the palace was already dead. The battle against the flames. On the night of the fire, 438 firefighters battled to save the Crystal Palace, but it was already too late. The scale of the response was unprecedented in British fire service history. 90 fire engines, crews from 40 different stations. Every available pump in South London and many from North London converged on Sydenham Hill. The coordination alone was remarkable. Multiple brigades working together, sharing equipment, managing water supply, directing hundreds of personnel. But from the moment they arrived, the firefighters faced an impossible task. The building's design, so revolutionary in its construction, became its executioner in its destruction. The open floor plan meant fire could travel horizontally without obstruction. The ventilation system created updrafts that fed oxygen to the flames. The iron framework conducted heat that ignited materials hundreds of feet from the primary fire. Commander Pollock established a command post on the southern lawn. He divided the building into sectors, assigned crews to each section. The strategy was clear. They would form a defensive perimeter, contain the fire to the palace itself, prevent it from spreading to the surrounding residential areas. Crews positioned themselves around the building's perimeter. They dragged hoses across the grounds, connected lines to hydrants. Some drew water from the ornamental lakes using portable pumps. The lakes had been built for aesthetic purposes. Now they served as emergency reservoirs. But even combined, they provided insufficient water pressure to combat a fire of this magnitude. The first challenge was access. The palace stood on elevated ground. Fire engines had to navigate narrow roads to reach the site. Some got stuck in traffic as crowds gathered to watch the spectacle. Thousands of Londoners flooded the area. They stood on hillsides, perched in trees, climbed onto rooftops. The orange glow illuminated faces that mixed horror with fascination. Police established cordons, pushed the crowds back, created routes for emergency vehicles. But the sheer number of spectators complicated everything. Estimates later suggested that over 100,000 people witnessed the fire. The largest gathering in South London history for an event that was pure destruction. Inside the burning palace, temperatures exceeded 2,000 degrees in some sections. The heat was so intense that iron girders sagged like melted candles. Glass didn't just break, it liquefied. Pools of molten glass formed on the ground floor, glowing white hot. The wooden sash bars vaporized. The putty burned with a chemical intensity that released toxic fumes. Firefighters attempted multiple entry points. Teams pushed into the north wing around 9 o'clock. They advanced perhaps 50 feet before the smoke and heat drove them back. The visibility was zero. The air was poison. Even with breathing apparatus, no one could survive more than a few minutes inside. One crew tried to reach the central transept from the western entrance. They made it to the main gallery. The ceiling above them was already compromised. They could hear the structure groaning, metal twisting, glass shattering. The crew chief ordered retreat. 30 seconds later, a section of the arched roof collapsed exactly where they had been standing. 200 tons of iron and glass crashed down. If they had delayed, the entire team would have been crushed. The water pressure problems became critical around 9:30. The hydrant system was designed for building fires, not conflagrations. The demand exceeded supply. Hoses ran dry. Pumps cavitated. Crews were forced to shut down some lines to maintain pressure in others. They prioritized the sectors most likely to spread to nearby structures. A residential street stood just 300 feet from the palace's eastern wing. Rows of Victorian terraced houses, families inside, If the fire jumped that gap, it would be catastrophic. Commander Pollock directed 8 engines to form a water wall between the palace and the houses. They maintained continuous streams, soaked the roofs, saturated the walls, turned the street into a buffer zone. The tactic worked. The houses remained untouched, but it meant abandoning any hope of saving the palace itself. Those resources could have been used to fight the primary fire. Instead, they were committed to defense, a necessary sacrifice. The palace was already lost. The goal was preventing wider disaster. By 10 o'clock, the fire had become self-sustaining. It no longer needed an external source. The burning materials generated enough heat to ignite adjacent materials continuously. The iron framework had become a network of heat pipes. Touch one column and feel it radiating thermal energy throughout its entire structure. The fire was using the building's own skeleton to spread. Firefighters standing 200 feet from the flames felt the heat on their faces. The radiant energy was like standing in front of an open furnace. Hoses became too hot to hold. The rubber degraded, sprung leaks. Crews had to rotate every 15 minutes. The exposure was too intense for longer shifts. Around 10:30, the central transept began its collapse. The process was slow, almost graceful. The arched roof sagged first. The iron ribs bent under their own weight. Glass panes fell in waves, cascading down like a waterfall. Then the main support columns buckled. The entire structure folded inward. 200 feet of roof crashed into the building's interior. The impact sent a blast of sparks and smoke skyward. The column of fire that erupted was visible for miles. The collapse sent a shockwave through the crowd. Gasps, screams. Some people turned away. Others couldn't stop watching. The palace that had stood for 85 years was devouring itself in real time. The destruction was terrible, mesmerizing, apocalyptic. Commander Pollock watched from his command post. He had fought fires for 26 years. House fires, factory fires, warehouse fires. Nothing compared to this. The heat, the scale, the sheer volume of combustible material. This wasn't a building fire. This was an industrial disaster. He made notes for his report. The building had been a fire hazard waiting to happen. Obsolete materials, no modern fire suppression systems, inadequate escape routes. The tragedy was that everyone involved likely knew this. But taking action would have required resources no one was willing to commit. Easier to hope nothing would go wrong, to assume the building would last forever despite all evidence to the contrary. By 11 o'clock, 90% of the palace had burned. Only the northern wing remained partially intact. Crews continued pouring water on the ruins, not to save anything, just to cool the wreckage, to prevent reignition. The temperature in the debris field would remain dangerously high for days. The last major collapse occurred at 11:40. The North Tower fell. 160 feet of iron and glass crashing down. The sound echoed across South London. Windows rattled in houses a mile away. The tower had been the palace's most recognizable feature, the landmark visible from across the city. Now it was rubble. By midnight, the flames had diminished. The fire had run out of fuel. Everything combustible had burned. What remained was a twisted maze of iron framework and shattered glass. The outline of the building was still visible. The skeleton stood, but everything else was gone. Firefighters would maintain watch through the night. Small fires continued to flare up. Hot spots reignited when air currents shifted. Full control wouldn't be achieved until dawn, and even then, the danger wouldn't be over. the wreckage was unstable. Sections could collapse at any moment. Investigation teams would have to wait days before safely entering the ruins. As the sun rose on December 1st, the full extent of the devastation became visible. The Crystal Palace, one of the most famous buildings in the world, had been reduced to a scorched metal skeleton surrounded by acres of broken glass. The sight was heartbreaking, surreal. Thousands of Londoners who had visited the palace over the decades stood in silent witness to its remains. But the story wasn't over. As investigators began searching the wreckage, they would discover something that made the tragedy even darker. Bodies, hidden in the collapsed sections. The forgotten, residents who had lived inside the palace's abandoned spaces. Their deaths would force Britain to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty, neglect, and the human cost of progress. The battle to save the Crystal Palace had failed. Now came the battle to understand what had truly been lost. The catastrophic collapse. As the night wore on, the Crystal Palace began to disintegrate, its massive iron frame collapsing in slow motion, as if the building itself were grieving. The physics of the collapse were brutal and elegant. Iron is strong. Iron is durable. But iron has a weakness. When heated beyond certain thresholds, it loses structural integrity. At 800 degrees Fahrenheit, iron begins to soften. At 1200 degrees, it becomes pliable. At 2000 degrees, it warps like clay. The fire inside the Crystal Palace reached temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees in multiple locations. The iron columns that supported the entire structure were exposed to sustained, extreme heat. They began deforming, bending, twisting. The building's skeleton was being unmade from within. The first major structural failure occurred at 9:45. A section of the southern transept roof detached from its supporting columns. The weight of the iron framework and remaining glass panes pulled the structure downward. The attached columns bent. Their bases, bolted to the foundation, couldn't flex. The stress exceeded the material's capacity. The bolts sheared, the columns toppled. 30 feet of roof crashed down. This triggered a cascade effect. The roof was not a single unified structure. It was modular. Individual sections connected to each other. When one section fell, it pulled on adjacent sections. Created stress forces those sections were never designed to handle. Within minutes, 100 feet of roof had collapsed. Each falling section created impacts that damaged the floor below. The floors themselves were iron plates supported by iron joists. The impacts from falling debris caused joists to buckle. Floors pancaked. First floor collapsed into ground floor. Ground floor buckled and fell into the basement level. The building was consuming itself from the inside. The central transept held longer than expected. This section had the strongest engineering. The arch design distributed weight more efficiently. The columns were thicker, the connections more robust. For an hour, it stood while fire raged around it, a defiant skeleton silhouetted against orange flame. But no structure can withstand infinite stress. At 10:30, the northeast corner column of the central transept reached failure temperature. The iron had been glowing cherry red for 20 minutes. The molecular structure had been compromised. When the column buckled, it didn't snap cleanly. It bent, folded. The top of the column dropped 6 feet, still attached at the base, still connected to the roof framework. That 6-foot drop redistributed the roof's weight to adjacent columns. Those columns were already stressed, already weakened by heat. They couldn't absorb the additional load. One failed, then another, then three at once. The entire eastern side of the central transept roof sagged, tilted at a 20-degree angle. For a moment, the structure hung suspended, balanced on failing supports. Every eye watching from the lawns was fixed on that frozen instant. Then gravity prevailed. The roof slid sideways, tore free from its remaining connections. 200 feet of arched iron and glass crashed into the building's interior. The sound was like thunder, like worlds ending. The impact created a pressure wave. Air blasted outward through broken windows. Glass shards sprayed across the grounds. Firefighters 100 feet away were knocked backward. The heat pulse was so intense that grass 50 feet from the building spontaneously browned. Inside the wreckage, fires that had been contained by walls suddenly had access to unlimited air. They exploded upward. New flames shot 200 feet high. The column of fire was so bright it illuminated the undersides of clouds. People standing in central London could see the orange glow reflecting off the sky. Some thought a bomb had exploded. Others believed a factory had detonated. The north wing held until 11:15. This section had been partially isolated from the main fire. Fire breaks installed during renovations in 1928 had slowed the flames' progress. The iron framework here was less compromised, but the heat radiating from the collapsed central transept eventually exceeded what the remaining structure could withstand. The collapse of the north wing was different, more complete. The southern sections had fallen in pieces, gradual disintegration, but the north wing went all at once. Every column failed simultaneously. The entire structure dropped straight down. 100 feet of building compressed into a 20-foot-high pile of wreckage in under 3 seconds. The impact crater was visible in the foundation. The force of the collapse drove debris 10 feet into the ground. Underground utility lines were severed. Water pipes burst. Flooding mixed with fire-heated wreckage to create clouds of steam. The scene looked like a battlefield, like something from a war zone rather than architectural catastrophe. The North Tower fell at 11:40. It had been swaying for 20 minutes. Visible movement. The entire structure oscillating in the updrafts from the fire below. Engineers watching knew it was going to fall. The question was when and in which direction. The tower fell eastward, away from the main building, toward the empty lawns, 160 feet of iron and glass that had stood since 1854 crashed down in 5 seconds. The impact sent tremors through the ground. Seismographs at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, 9 miles away, registered the event. They initially classified it as a minor earthquake, magnitude 1.3. Only later did they realize they had recorded a building dying. By midnight, almost nothing remained upright. The southern transept was flattened. The central transept was gone. The north wing was rubble. The north tower was a twisted heap of metal on the lawn. Only scattered sections of the eastern and western galleries still had portions of framework standing. Perhaps 20% of the original structure, and even that was compromised. Unstable, likely to collapse in the coming hours. The wreckage field covered 17 acres. Twisted iron girders jutted from the debris at strange angles. Glass fragments formed drifts like snow. In some places, the glass layer was 3 feet deep, sharp, treacherous, impassable without protective equipment. The heat radiating from the wreckage made it impossible to approach. Firefighters maintained a perimeter but couldn't enter. The temperature in the debris field exceeded 500 degrees in many spots. Pockets of fire still burned deep in the pile. They would continue burning for another 12 hours. As dawn broke on December 1st, the true scale of destruction became visible. The building that had covered nearly 8 acres was reduced to a wasteland of broken metal and glass. The ornamental grounds surrounding the palace were scorched. Trees were dead from heat exposure. The grass was ash. The artificial lakes had dropped 3 feet from fire crews pumping out water all night. Londoners who arrived at sunrise stood in stunned silence. Many had visited the palace as children, had memories of exhibitions, concerts, festivals. Those memories had a physical location, a tangible connection to the past. Now that place was erased. The building was gone. The memories felt untethered, adrift. But the physical destruction, as complete as it wasn't the end of the tragedy. As smoke cleared and investigators prepared to search the wreckage, a darker discovery awaited. Hidden in the collapsed sections were bodies, the forgotten people who had lived inside the palace. Some had escaped, others had not. Their deaths would transform the fire from architectural disaster into human tragedy. And their stories would force Britain to ask uncomfortable questions about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten when empires fall and monuments burn. Firefighters. In the cold light of morning, the ruins of the Crystal Palace stood as a testament to what had been lost. But the story wasn't over yet. The investigation began on December 2nd. The wreckage had cooled enough to allow careful entry. Teams of fire investigators, structural engineers, and police worked together. They documented the destruction, photographed the debris, tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to such complete catastrophe. The scale of the site made systematic investigation nearly impossible. 17 acres of twisted metal and broken glass. No clear pathways. Unstable debris that could shift without warning. The teams worked slowly, marked safe routes, established protocols. But even with caution, the work was dangerous. Small collapses occurred regularly. Pockets of still smoldering material ignited when exposed to air. On the afternoon of December 3rd, investigators searching the Eastern Gallery found the first body. A man, elderly, identified later as Thomas Aitken. He had died from smoke inhalation. His body was found in a storage room, a dead end. He had been so close to an exit, 50 feet. But in the smoke and darkness, he had made a wrong turn. That mistake had cost him his life. The discovery changed everything. This wasn't just property damage. This was a death, possibly multiple deaths. The investigation expanded. More personnel were assigned. Search patterns became more thorough. The goal was no longer just understanding what happened. It was recovering all victims. Over the next week, 5 more bodies were discovered in the wreckage. Mary Wickham was not among them. She had escaped. But others had not. 4 men and 1 woman, ages ranging from 28 to 67. All homeless, all living secretly in the abandoned sections of the palace. All killed when the fire trapped them in corridors they thought they knew. The revelation horrified Britain. Newspapers ran front-page stories. The Crystal Palace fire became more than architectural loss. It became a symbol of social failure. How had these people been living in the building without anyone intervening? How had society allowed its most vulnerable citizens to take shelter in a deteriorating monument because they had nowhere else to go? Questions were asked in Parliament. The Minister of Housing faced harsh scrutiny. The Palace Management Company was accused of criminal negligence. They knew people were living in the building. They had chosen to ignore it. Now those people were dead. Public inquiries were launched. Multiple investigations ran simultaneously. The fire brigade. Inquiry focused on the fire's cause and spread. The coroner's inquest focused on the deaths. The government inquiry focused on broader questions of building safety and social welfare. Each investigation produced reports, recommendations, calls for change. The fire brigade report concluded that the blaze started in a small office in the southern transept. The exact ignition source could not be determined. Electrical fault was most likely. But the report was unambiguous about what allowed the fire to spread so quickly. Flammable putty, dried wood, lack of fire suppression systems, inadequate safety protocols. The palace had been a disaster waiting to happen. The coroner's inquest returned verdicts of accidental death for all 6 victims. But the coroner added a rider to his verdict, a formal statement calling for better housing support and homeless services. The deaths, he wrote, were preventable. Not because the fire could have been stopped, but because those people should never have been living in an abandoned building in the first place. The government inquiry produced the most damning report. It documented decades of deferred maintenance, financial mismanagement, regulatory failures. The palace management company had known the building was unsafe, had known about the homeless residents, had chosen profit over safety. The report recommended criminal charges. Company officers should face prosecution for manslaughter. But the legal proceedings went nowhere. The palace company declared bankruptcy. The officers resigned. Without a functioning entity to prosecute, the charges were dropped. Justice, such as it was, remained incomplete. The dead remained dead. The company dissolved, and life moved on. The public response was more immediate. Donations poured in to support homeless charities. Shelters opened across London. For a brief moment, the Crystal Palace fire galvanized action on social issues that had been ignored for years. The government allocated emergency funds for housing assistance. Parliament passed new building safety regulations. Inspections became mandatory for large structures. But the reforms were temporary. The attention faded. Within a year, funding was cut. Shelters closed. The homeless population grew again. The lessons learned were forgotten. Britain had been shocked by the tragedy, but shock is not the same as sustained commitment. Real change requires more than outrage. It requires sacrifice, resources, political will, and those were always in short supply. The wreckage of the Crystal Palace remained on Sydenham Hill for months. Clearing it was a massive undertaking. The iron had to be cut apart, hauled away. Some was sold for scrap, some was melted down and reforged. The glass was simply buried. Thousands of tons of shattered panes pushed into pits and covered with earth. The foundation remained. The artificial lakes remained. The terraced grounds remained. But the building itself was gone, erased. By the summer of 1937, the site looked like it had never held anything. Just empty lawns and a few remaining statuary pieces from the original landscaping. Plans for rebuilding were proposed. Architects submitted designs. A new Crystal Palace, modern materials, fireproof construction. But the will wasn't there. The money wasn't there. World War II was approaching. Britain's attention turned to other concerns. The plans were shelved, then forgotten. The site eventually became a public park, Crystal Palace Park. The name is all that remains. That and the dinosaur sculptures in the lake. Victorian reconstructions of prehistoric creatures created in 1854. They stand today, the only physical remnants of what the Crystal Palace once was. Visitors walk the grounds without knowing what stood there. The park is popular. Families picnic on the lawns. Children play. Joggers run the paths. Life continues. But something important was lost. Not just a building, not just 6 lives, something larger, a connection to the past, a monument that represented a moment when Britain believed anything was possible. The fire destroyed more than iron and glass. It destroyed a symbol, and symbols matter. They anchor collective memory, give shape to national identity. When they disappear, part of us disappears with them. The Crystal Palace had been a tangible link to Victorian grandeur, a reminder of what Britain had achieved. Losing it meant losing that connection, that sense of continuity with greatness. In the decades since the fire, historians have debated what the palace truly represented. Was it a celebration of innovation, or a monument to imperial exploitation? Was it a democratic space where all classes could gather, or an expensive distraction that ignored real social problems? The truth, as always, is complicated. The Crystal Palace was all of those things, triumphant and troubling, beautiful and flawed. A symbol of human achievement built on systems of inequality. Its destruction revealed that complexity, forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths, what we celebrate, what we ignore, who we remember, who we forget. The bodies found in the wreckage represented the people Britain chose not to see. The cost of progress that no one wanted to acknowledge. For 85 years, the palace stood as a monument to success. But success always has victims. People who don't benefit, who are left behind, who find shelter in the ruins of dreams they had no part in building. The fire made those people visible for a moment. Then they were forgotten again, just like the building, just like the empire it represented, all of it fading into history, remembered selectively, understood incompletely. A story we tell ourselves about who we were and what we valued. But stories are not truth. They are choices, decisions about what to emphasize and what to omit. And the Crystal Palace fire forced a moment of honesty. A glimpse at what lay hidden beneath the beautiful surface. Before the story could be sanitized again, before we could return to comfortable myths about progress and glory. The cost of beauty. The Crystal Palace may have been gone, but the question lingered. What was the true cost of creating something so beautiful? Joseph Paxton's dream had been realized. For 85 years, the Crystal Palace stood as proof that humanity could transcend limitations, could build structures that defied conventional wisdom, could create beauty on an unprecedented scale. But the fire revealed that every achievement carries hidden expenses. Some paid up front, some deferred, some never acknowledged until disaster forces recognition. Consider the financial cost first. The original construction in Hyde Park cost £79,800. The relocation and expansion to Sydenham cost £1.3 million. Maintenance over 8 decades consumed millions more. The total investment exceeded £3 million. In modern terms, that approaches $500 million. An enormous sum. What did that money buy? A building that lasted 8 decades, that hosted millions of visitors. That became an international landmark. By pure accounting, perhaps it was worth it. The cultural value generated might justify the expense. But accounting is never pure. Every pound spent on the palace was a pound not spent elsewhere. On housing, on schools, on infrastructure, on services for those who actually needed them. The opportunity cost was real. During the palace's lifetime, Britain remained a deeply unequal society. Poverty was endemic. Working-class families lived in squalid conditions. Child mortality was high. Basic sanitation was lacking in many areas. Yet millions of pounds were poured into maintaining a monument to Victorian ambition. The priorities were clear. Beauty for some mattered more than dignity for all. Then there was the human cost. The workers who built the palace faced dangerous conditions. Construction at that scale, at that speed, meant corners were cut. Safety was secondary. Men fell from scaffolding, were crushed by falling materials. The records are incomplete, but estimates suggest dozens died during construction. Their names were not recorded. Their families received no compensation. They were simply lost in pursuit of someone else's vision. The homeless who lived in the abandoned sections paid a different cost. They sought shelter in a structure that society had valued more than their lives. The irony was brutal. The building that once symbolized progress became a trap for those progress had discarded. 6 of them died in the fire. But how many others suffered in the years before? How many cold winters? How many hungry nights? The palace provided physical shelter, but no dignity, no recognition, no path forward. And what about the emotional cost? Thousands of Londoners had memories tied to the palace. Childhood visits, first dates, family outings. When the building burned, those memories lost their anchor. The place that held them disappeared. There is grief in that kind of loss, not as acute as losing a person, but real. The destruction of shared spaces damages collective memory, fragments our connection to the past. The architectural cost was perhaps most obvious. The Crystal Palace was unique. Once destroyed, it could never be truly replicated. Modern reconstructions could approximate the design, could use similar materials, but they would lack authenticity, the patina of age, the accumulated history. When something irreplaceable is lost, the world becomes slightly diminished, less rich, less diverse. Consider what motivated the creation of the palace. Pride, competition, the desire to prove British superiority. These are not inherently evil motivations, but they are not inherently good either. They exist independent of moral judgment. The question is what price we are willing to pay in service of them. How much money? How many lives? How much inequality? The Great Exhibition of 1851 was designed to showcase British industry, to demonstrate that Britain led the world in innovation. The Crystal Palace was the physical embodiment of that message. But the message was incomplete. It showed machines, products, technical achievements. It did not show the slums where workers lived, the factories where children labored, the colonies where resources were extracted through force. The beauty on display concealed the violence that made it possible. This pattern repeats throughout history. Great monuments are built to celebrate power. Pyramids, cathedrals, palaces, skyscrapers, each represents the capabilities of its civilization. But capabilities are not the same as values. We can build magnificent structures while treating people terribly. Technical achievement does not imply moral achievement. The two are separate. The Crystal Palace proved Britain could engineer marvels. It said nothing about whether Britain was a good place to live for those without wealth. After the fire, there was brief recognition of this disconnect. The homeless deaths sparked outrage. Reforms were proposed. For a moment, society acknowledged that building monuments while ignoring human suffering was morally indefensible. But that moment passed. The reforms faded. Attention moved elsewhere. We returned to celebrating beauty without asking about cost. This is the persistent question. Not whether we should create beautiful things, but whether we should create them when their cost is measured in human suffering. Is a magnificent building worth maintaining if its expenses mean less support for those in need? Is architectural glory justified when it exists alongside poverty? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are practical ones with real consequences. The answer is not simple. We need beauty. We need monuments. We need shared spaces that inspire and unite us. Eliminating all expenditure on grand projects would impoverish culture, but we also need balance, recognition that beauty has limits, that some costs are too high, that people matter more than buildings. The Crystal Palace could have been maintained properly, could have been made safe, could have excluded homeless people without also abandoning them to the streets. These were choices, decisions about priorities. The palace management chose profit over safety. Society chose monuments over welfare. And when the fire came, those choices had consequences. 6 people died. A landmark was destroyed. And for a brief moment, we had to confront what we had valued and what we had ignored. The lesson, if we are willing to learn it, is this: beauty is not free. Achievement is not free. Everything we create carries cost. The question is who pays, and whether we are willing to acknowledge that price or prefer to keep it hidden until disaster reveals what we buried. The legacy of a dream. Despite its destruction, the Crystal Palace lived on in the hearts of those who remembered it, and in the history it helped shape. Architecture students still study Joseph Paxton's design, the modular construction, the prefabrication, the use of iron and glass to create vast open spaces. These techniques influenced generations of architects. You can see the palace's legacy in train stations, in conservatories, in modern shopping arcades. The idea that buildings could be assembled from standardized components rather than constructed in place revolutionized the industry. The Great Exhibition of 1851 set a template that endures today. World's fairs, international expositions. These events trace their lineage directly to that first exhibition in Hyde Park. The concept of gathering the world's achievements in one place for public display became a recurring feature of global culture. Paris, Chicago, New York, Brussels, cities competed to host exhibitions, to build their own monuments to progress. Some of those monuments still stand. The Eiffel Tower was built for the 1889 Paris Exposition. It was intended to be temporary. Like the Crystal Palace, it was supposed to be demolished after the event ended, but public affection saved it. The tower remains, a permanent fixture of the Paris skyline. The legacy the Crystal Palace might have had if circumstances had been different. The palace also influenced museum design, the open floor plan, the emphasis on natural light, the idea of creating immersive environments where visitors could experience rather than just observe. Modern museums owe much to the Crystal Palace's approach. The building was not just a container for exhibits. It was part of the exhibition itself. The architecture enhanced the experience. But the legacy extends beyond design. The palace represented something fundamental about Victorian culture: the belief in progress, the confidence that human ingenuity could solve any problem, the faith that technology would create a better world. These ideas shaped the 19th century and echo into our present. We still believe in progress, still invest in grand projects, still build monuments to human achievement. Yet we also inherited the palace's contradictions. the tension between public beauty and private suffering, the celebration of innovation alongside exploitation of labor, the monuments that inspire some while excluding others. These contradictions remain unresolved. We still build gleaming structures while homelessness persists, still fund grand projects while basic needs go unmet. The Crystal Palace was destroyed, but the systems that created it endure. The fire itself became part of British cultural memory, stories passed down through families. My grandmother saw it burn. I was there that night. These personal connections to historical events create continuity across generations. The palace existed within living memory for decades after its destruction. People who had visited as children grew old, telling stories about what it was like, what they remembered, how it felt to walk through those glass galleries. As those people died, direct memory faded. Now we rely on photographs, paintings, written accounts. The palace exists as historical artifact rather than lived experience. This transition happens with all history. The moment when the last person who remembers dies and everything becomes secondhand, interpretation rather than witness. The palace crossed that threshold sometime in the 1990s. Now no one alive remembers visiting it. We know it only through documents and images, through stories told by those who heard stories from those who were there. But absence can be as powerful as presence. The empty space on Sydenham Hill carries its own significance. What is not there becomes meaningful. Visitors to Crystal Palace Park often ask where the building stood. They want to see the footprint, to visualize the scale. The absence invites imagination in ways the presence might not. We can project our own visions onto the empty space, create our own understanding of what it meant. This is how monuments become myths, how real buildings transform into symbols. The physical Crystal Palace was flawed, had financial problems, maintenance issues, homeless people living in its corridors. But the mythic Crystal Palace transcends those problems. It becomes pure idea, a representation of Victorian achievement, untainted by Victorian reality. We remember the beauty, forget the cost. This selective memory is how we create heritage. Heritage is not history. History is messy, complicated, full of contradictions. Heritage is clean, simplified, designed to inspire rather than challenge. The Crystal Palace's heritage emphasizes innovation, ambition, achievement. It downplays exploitation, inequality, the 6 people who died in the fire. This editing is natural, perhaps even necessary. We need stories that unite us, that give us collective identity. But we must be careful. The gap between heritage and history can become dangerous. When we sanitize the past too thoroughly, we lose important lessons. The palace teaches us about ambition's double edge, about the price of dreams, about who benefits from progress and who pays its costs. These lessons remain relevant. We still build ambitious projects, still celebrate innovation, still create beauty while inequality persists. The structures change, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental dynamics remain. The Crystal Palace was a specific building in a specific time, but it represents patterns that transcend its particulars. Other buildings have burned since: Notre Dame in Paris, the National Museum in Brazil. Each loss sparks similar reactions: grief, shock, questions about what we failed to protect. These fires remind us that cultural heritage is fragile, that preservation requires constant effort, that nothing lasts forever without deliberate care. The Crystal Palace fire was a warning, but warnings are only useful if we heed them. The palace's ultimate legacy might be the questions it forces us to ask. What do we value? What are we willing to sacrifice to achieve it? Who determines those priorities? How do we balance beauty and utility, monument and welfare, past and present? These questions have no permanent answers. Each generation must confront them anew, make its own choices, live with its own consequences. The Crystal Palace existed for 85 years. It has been gone for 88. Soon it will have been absent longer than it was present. Yet we still talk about it, still study it, still argue about what it meant. This persistence is its true legacy, not the building itself, but the conversation it continues to generate, the reflection it inspires, the questions it refuses to let us ignore. Monuments are supposed to be permanent, to outlast their creators, to stand as testament for all time. The Crystal Palace failed at that task. It burned, disappeared, became absence. But perhaps that failure is more meaningful than success would have been. A standing palace might have become mundane, familiar, ignored. Its destruction made it eternal, froze it in memory at the height of its significance, ensured we would never stop asking what it meant and what its loss teaches us. The price of ambition. As the ruins of the Crystal Palace were cleared, one question remained. What does this story teach us about ambition, beauty, and the cost of dreaming? Ambition built the Crystal Palace. Joseph Paxton's ambition to prove a gardener could outdesign professional architects. Prince Albert's ambition to showcase British superiority. The nation's ambition to lead the world into a new industrial age. Ambition is not evil. It drives progress, creates innovation, pushes humanity beyond current limitations. Without ambition, we would stagnate, never attempt the difficult, never reach for the impossible. But ambition without wisdom is dangerous. The Crystal Palace was conceived in ambition, designed in ambition, built in ambition, and ultimately destroyed by the consequences of ambitious choices. Rapid construction that prioritized speed over longevity. Materials selected for cost and convenience rather than fire safety. Maintenance deferred because profit mattered more than preservation. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation. Collectively, they created catastrophe. This is ambition's trap. The initial vision is pure. The early execution is brilliant, but sustaining achievement requires different skills than creating it. Maintaining a monument is less exciting than building one. The ongoing work is tedious, expensive, invisible until neglected. The Crystal Palace's creators moved on to new projects, left the building to managers who saw it as an expense rather than an obligation. This pattern repeats constantly. We celebrate founders, forget maintainers, value creation over preservation. Then wonder why things fall apart. The fire was not an accident in the sense of being unforeseeable. Every expert knew the palace was dangerous. The flammable materials, the lack of fire suppression, the compromised structure. Warning signs were ignored because addressing them would have been costly, inconvenient. Acknowledgement would have required action. Easier to hope nothing would go wrong. To assume luck would hold. This is how disasters happen, not through sudden catastrophic failure, through accumulated small failures, through decisions to defer problems rather than solve them. The homeless living in the palace represent another dimension of ambition's cost. Victorian Britain invested enormous resources in grand projects. The Crystal Palace, the railway network, the empire. These ambitions consumed capital and attention. Meanwhile, basic social welfare remained underfunded. The contradiction is stark. A nation wealthy enough to maintain a glass palace for 85 years, but unable to house its most vulnerable, Citizens, not unable, unwilling. The resources existed. The priorities were elsewhere. This is not unique to Victorian Britain. Every society faces similar choices: where to invest limited resources, what to prioritize, grand projects or basic needs, monuments or services. There is no easy answer. We need both. But the balance matters. Tipping too far toward monuments means neglecting people. Too far toward immediate needs means cultural impoverishment. The Crystal Palace represents what happens when the balance tilts away from maintenance and welfare, when ambition becomes unmoored from responsibility. Beauty has value. The Crystal Palace was beautiful, inspiring. It gave pleasure to millions, made them feel wonder, connected them to something larger than daily struggle. These benefits are real, not frivolous. Culture matters, shared spaces matter. Architecture that elevates human experience matters. We should build beautiful things, create monuments, invest in projects that enrich collective life, but not at any cost. Not when the price includes human suffering we could have prevented. The 6 people who died in the fire had names: Thomas Aitken, Mary Wickham barely escaped. The others remain less documented, but they were people, with histories, families, dreams. They ended up homeless not through moral failure, but through economic systems that discarded them when they were no longer profitable. The society that maintained the Crystal Palace failed to maintain them. This failure was a choice. Resources that could have provided housing and support went elsewhere. The beautiful building mattered more than the broken people. Confronting this reality is uncomfortable. We prefer to celebrate achievement, to focus on what we built rather than who we abandoned. Heritage narratives emphasize glory, minimize cost. This selective memory is understandable, but dangerous. When we forget what ambition costs, we risk repeating mistakes, building new monuments while creating new victims. The Crystal Palace fire forces us to remember, to acknowledge that every achievement has consequences, that someone always pays. What then should we do with this knowledge? Stop building, stop dreaming? That would be wrong. Ambition drives human progress. We need it, but we need it tempered with wisdom. With recognition that how we achieve matters as much as what we achieve. With commitment to ensuring that success does not require sacrifice from those least able to bear it. This is possible, difficult, but possible. It requires choosing to prioritize balance over glory, sustainability over spectacle, people over monuments when the two conflict. The Crystal Palace could have been saved, not the building itself on that November night. Once the fire reached critical mass, destruction was inevitable. But the conditions that made the fire possible could have been prevented. Proper maintenance, modern fire safety, social services that ensured no one had to live in abandoned buildings. These measures would have been expensive, but less expensive than the ultimate cost. 6 lives, a national treasure, a permanent loss. The palace's destruction teaches us that neglect has consequences, that deferred problems compound, that systems require maintenance or they fail. These lessons apply beyond buildings, to infrastructure, to institutions, to societies. Everything requires ongoing effort to sustain. Nothing lasts through inertia alone. The Victorians built magnificently, then assumed their creations would endure forever. They were wrong. We make the same assumption about our own achievements. We will also be wrong unless we learn the lesson. Ambition is not the enemy. Neglect is the enemy. Inequality is the enemy. Choosing monuments over people is the enemy. The Crystal Palace represents both Victorian achievement and Victorian failure. The ability to create marvels, the refusal to maintain them or care for those they displaced. Both are part of the legacy. Both deserve remembrance. As we build our own monuments, we should remember the palace, remember its beauty, remember its innovation, but also remember its flaws. Remember the hidden costs. Remember the forgotten people. Remember that every structure, physical or social, requires maintenance. That ambition without wisdom leads to disaster. That dreams have prices, and we must decide whether we are willing to pay them justly. The Crystal Palace is gone. The space it occupied is empty. But the questions it raises remain. They should remain. Every generation must answer them anew. What do we value? Who do we value? How do we balance competing goods? What price are we willing to pay for beauty? And who do we expect to pay it? These questions have no permanent answers. But asking them honestly is how we avoid repeating the mistakes that turned a monument to achievement into a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition. The palace burned, the dream died, but the lesson survives, if we are brave enough to learn it.